So the next video that we're going to watch about Labour is actually it's from a friend of the show, Richard Tice of Reform UK. The title of the video is "I'll Eat My Shoes if Starmer builds 1.5 million homes in 5 years." So I look forward to archiving this content in case it does happen. Now, I don't think it will happen. I actually agree with Richard Tice if that's a statement that he's making or his guest is making. But if it does, it'll be very, very funny to hold him for his statement here. Let's watch.
There are so many implications of high levels of immigration. We heard it earlier from Paul Morland and Christian Niemitz, but I deliberately didn't talk about the impact on housing because my next guest in the studio is a housing expert, one Russell Quirk, property and housing expert. Russell, very good evening. Thanks for being on the show. Now, This guy got banned on Twitter because he got into an argument with Maoists, right? He lost his Twitter account because he kept insulting Maoists who were insulting him for being a landlord. It was very, very funny. Numbers. Firstly, were you shocked by these?
What, the net migration numbers?
Net migration, and indeed the gross number.
Well, yes, I was, but also the fact that they had to be revised.
Yes.
Of course, that there was a little bit of stealth gone on in previous years by the looks of it.
Like by 20%,
yes.
Not just a few percent.
Yes.
They seem to have changed the methodology.
Yes, it's huge, and obviously, not just from a housing perspective, but from the point of view of all resources, completely and utterly unsustainable.
And so let's just look at housing, because clearly, we know that basically, the cost of renting has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
You've got the usual sort of economic factors of demand and supply. And we've got a graph here, which you'll remember earlier in the show, had the graph of the immigration numbers, which is the blue line on this graphic. Now, Russell, the red line, and this is since 1964 to now, the red line on this graph is the housing completions during that same period. So you've got net immigration soaring in recent years, and you've got a collapse in housing numbers. So
yes. So we've got both graphs going the wrong way. So we have net migration increasing substantially, as you can see from the graph. From the point of view of housing supply, so the provision of new homes, so whether that's sale or rental, because it all comes out of the same pot effectively, what we've actually seen in real terms is a halving, so 50% reduction in housing provision since the 1960s.
Now, this is, of course, a big problem. It is a big problem that we have too many people coming in and not enough houses being built. We shouldn't have enough houses being built anyway to be able to replace the supply of houses that are unlivable now, to be able to replace the fact that so many of our houses are being used as investment vehicles or second homes or short-term rentals, right? There are huge amounts of problems with our housing sector that not enough supply is being put into residential, explicitly not enough going into council rentals, and the entirety of our housing sector has been shoved into the hands of private landlords who can essentially do what they want with what's happening here, right? So we need to have more houses. Now, these migration figures will come down as a special year because of Ukraine and because of Hong Kong, but they're still high and have been higher consistently throughout the entirety of this Conservative government, whilst house building has massively dropped off the face of the cliff, right? So we do need to be building way more houses. As for Maria's question, where's the money going to come from? If you're building council houses using state money, it can come from fiscal expansion, right? It can just come with new money from the state, right? Part of the fiscal rules, the Rachel Reeves fiscal rules, no less, is that what you need, if you're going to spend new money, is it has to be on investment on increasing capacity of goods and services in the economy, right? Otherwise, you can lead to inflation. What's good is if you're spending money explicitly on building new houses, that is increasing the supply. So there you are, right? It is an investment, right? Only borrowing to invest is part of Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, which is literally this works. This is how this is an investment in new council homes. So if you don't want to understand where the money is going to come from for new houses, the state can just spend money building them.
So in the days of the Macmillan government and during the 60s and 70s, typically about 300,000 new homes were built and produced in Britain every year. Now, over the last 13 years, so since the start of this particular government, it's only 168,000 homes. And I have to say to you, Labour, not that much better. So before the Labour supporters start crowing and saying, oh, well, we'll be much, much better when we get in next year. No, they won't, because their average is only 180,000 homes per year versus their own self-imposed targets of 300,000 a year.
Secure.
And again, to bring up my favourite stats, in 10 years of Tony Blair, fewer council houses were built than in 3 years of Boris Johnson, right? The shortfall in terms of Labour governance is because of how many years of that Labour governance was under neoliberalism, right? And also likewise with the Tories. You know, people like Eden or Macmillan were still building council houses, still having hundreds of thousands, 300, 400,000 of houses, like 300,000 houses built each year, right? Lots of you which were council houses. It's not just a Tory Labour problem, it's a neoliberalism social democracy problem.
Starmer has promised they'll do he's promised he'll build 1.5 million in 5 years, so that's 300,000 a year.
Yeah.
When did we last build 300,000 homes in this country?
In the 1960s.
In the 1960s?
Yeah, and if Keir Starmer manages to do that, I will eat my shoes, Richard.
Remember that, folks? You heard it here first. Russell has promised to eat his shoes if in the next 5 years we build 300,000 homes.
It's simply not going to happen.
I agree with you.
I mean, yeah, it's not going to happen because their current plans is change the planning sector and then cross our fingers. Just if you change the planning sector, they will build. Which, of course, won't happen. So I actually, unfortunately, agree with Russell Quirk and Richard Tice.
I think that's very unlikely. I promised last week to eat my hat on something else. I'm not going to promise to eat anything else. But here's the thing. We're not going to build 300,000 a year. These numbers are going through the roof. So what does that mean? Does it basically mean rents are going up and up?
Well, everything's going up. So if you look at house prices, I mean, house prices are up, despite the recent dip, by about 20% since just before the pandemic. So 20% just in the last 3 or 4 years. You know, we've seen an incredible increase in house values, both for sale and for rental, simply because of the shortage of supply versus demand. There have been multiple studies that say that immigration alone over the last 20 years or so has added about 20% to house prices, just immigration alone.
So that graphic.
But think of all the middle class people who now have a much higher value asset because they got on the property ladder 30 years ago, right? Sure, young people may be paying higher rents, but they're paying high rents to boomers who have multiple houses that they got because of right to buy. And isn't that the real dream, to be able to make money off impoverished millennials? What I will point out, though, is that despite the fact that it is true that migration and high levels of migration have increased prices on housing, that does get offset somewhat by the fact that we are not at replacement birth rates in this country. So there will need to be some amount of migration to be able to deal with the fact that we are not having enough babies in terms of replacement rates.
That showed the housing completions against the immigration. You can see that actually pre-1990, you had far more houses being built, and you didn't have this huge price growth, and therefore the impact for young people. Actually, they suffer the most. It's ever harder to get on the housing ladder, and I guess essentially, people's become more cramped. More people have to live in the same homes, the same dwellings,
particularly now,
sort of to bunk up in order to be able to live.
Yeah, so there was some mitigation in recent years with interest rates being ridiculously low, but now they've gone back to what I would call normal levels. And by the way, 5% interest rates are not high by historic standards. Now interest rates have gone back to normal.
Whoa. Interest rates not being high in historic standards. I thought that the economy has crashed and that Labour can't do anything and that there's no money left and we've run up the national credit card. I thought that these high interest rates that we had, these apocalyptic interest rates, meant that Labour couldn't spend any money and their hands were tied. Okay, maybe in fact it could actually not be the case, and Labour have chosen that they don't want to spend any money because they could just build a bunch of council houses. They could literally build panel housing and go full Soviet. I've suggested it at this point because we have this real problem. So if you look at Canada, for example, the Conservative Party have raced up the polls because they're running on a housing platform of building loads of new housing, right? Whilst Labour promised they're going to build loads of new housing, they've not told you how they're actually going to do it, right? They're not given a proper plan how that's going to happen other than just relax the planning laws and cross our fingers. Whereas if they actually just ran on a platform just building a bunch of council houses to make sure that rents went down, right? They get huge swathes of voters coming to them. And that'd be a good thing if they did, right? This is why I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with talking about new money for new council housing. I keep banging on about it every single day. I even texted the Rachel Reeves Ring-In live segment on LBC. They didn't ask her my question, but specifically on the new money for council housing, because it's necessary. We need it. We need it to increase the supply, and not just increase the supply down the road once the private sector's, wrung their hands around it a bit and twiddled their thumbs. Homes England can be given the money and the planning permission and could be building tomorrow, right? They could do it. The state has the power. The state has the power, and they just won't do it. And we are running into this situation where we could end up with a Canada situation with some kind of right-winger running on this massive bonfire of regulations, and then we'll just end up turning our country into Coruscant by building a bunch of houses that aren't actually going into the hands of councils or local authorities or the state to be able to provide it for people cheaply, but in the hands of other landlords to be able to, whilst still having cheaper rents, still be scalping off the top of young people instead of actually building collectively owned resources for the future use for everybody. Because I don't think many young people are looking at this and going, well, actually, I can't get on the housing ladder. I think most young people are looking at this and going, my rents are literally unaffordable, right? Even if house prices massively drop, how am I ever going to be able to afford a deposit when all of my money is going on rent? They just want rents to go down. They do want rent caps in the short term, but they need council housing to have cheaper rents available for them immediately. We need more council housing to deal with the homeless problem. Councils are on the verge of all going bankrupt, Section 114s all over the shop, because there's going to be a massive, massive increase in the necessity of homeless provision over the course of the winter months. Over the course of the winter months, they're going to have to actually deal with the homeless problem, which is bankrupting all of the councils, and they've not got the housing stock, whether it would be temporary accommodation or whether it be actual council housing, to deal with the fact that loads of people are just on the street because they can't afford the rents, they can't afford to live, and that's going to bankrupt councils even further, so you have to sell off more assets, so have even fewer council houses in totality, right? The only solution is building loads of new council housing now, immediately, and it can't wait. We can't just wait for the private sector to be able to get that, get their act together and find something to do, right? Because even then, only a certain percentage of it will be quote-unquote affordable, and affordable is only 80% of market rate. And that's not affordable. 80% of market rate is still unaffordable. It's just the rents are even unaffordable on top of that. So we need new council housing with rents that are affordable and not as a mixture of, the private sector building some with the small handful of affordable homes. No, massive new estates of council houses.
Normal levels, of course, there is no more that mitigation. So for first-time buyers, it's getting harder and harder. But to the point in terms of how those houses get built, and it's not just Keir Starmer and previous prime ministers of all political flavours that have just literally licked a finger and stuck it in the air and said we are going to build this many houses. Well, it's nothing but wishful thinking and rhetoric. The reason they won't, frankly, is because the contrast now between where we are today on house building in the 1960s is two things. First of all, we used to build lots and lots of council houses back in the 1960s and 70s. Yep. So about half those 300,000 homes were social homes that were needed. But the other reason is that we are now, whether we like it or not, and I say this as a huge capitalist, by the way, before anybody starts telling me off for being a socialist, we are in the hands, in terms of housing supply, of just 10 PLC house builders. They now control almost all new builds being built.
Some would say, well, we need to get a grip and we need to ease the planning regulations, and it'd be great for the economy if we built 300,000 or 400,000 a year.
It's not
fantastic.
It's a misnomer to say it's the planning process. So the difference between those planning permissions granted over 10 years and the houses actually built is huge. There's a huge gap, a bit like your graph there, insofar as planning consents versus what's built.
So you're blaming the developers?
I'm blaming the house builders. I don't blame them, because if they are working to the behest of their shareholders, I don't blame them. That's their job. But
okay, so what you're admitting is that capitalism has failed. It's not the planning, right? It's just the material interests of the capitalist companies looking out for their shareholders. So you've literally admitted that capitalism is at fault here, right? And the state needs to step in to build council housing. So you can't just say, well, actually, no, I am a devout capitalist, so don't call me a socialist, and then make a critique of capitalism, right? I mean, maybe you say you're a critical capitalist and say that there needs to be more kind of interventionist capitalism, like a social democracy, right? That's a position that you can hold. But you've just gone, I'm a devout capitalist, but you know what the real problem is here? These people looking after their shareholders.
So might a Labour government say, well, actually, we're going to borrow more money.
How are they going to do it?
Or print more money, and they might say, we're just going to build 150,000 council homes on government-owned land.
And I wish they would. But the problem is governments and local authorities don't know how to build houses. They're not developers. It's wishful thinking. It's easy.
Homes England is the governmental department that literally exists to know how to develop houses, Russell. You can't just say, well, it's the state, so it's inefficient and they don't know what they're doing, when they've literally existed for decades as the explicit arm of the government for developing houses. If anything, all these fucking Taylor Wimpey houses show the private sector doesn't know what they're doing, because all they care about is profit, so they don't build good houses, they're shoddy quality, and their necessity of building this poorly is because of cyclical consumption, because they don't want to lose future business by not having to build for another 200 years, which, you know, the house I currently live in is almost 100 years old at this point, because it was built before we had the Taylor Wimpeys in this world.
Easy to say, and frankly, look, it's if you don't do something about the stranglehold of those top 10 house builders who have no social
they've got
have
the
no social
stranglehold.
responsibility.
No, absolutely. Well,
no capitalists have social responsibility. There is zero social responsibility about capitalism. It's all about the short-term interest of shareholders, of profit being the primary motivator. In some markets, I admit that has some functions. I think I would change the system in which we distribute and own those capital resources. I would own them collectively rather than individually, right? But the function of market-based economies in search of profit can have some positive utility. I'm not going to decry that, right? Even Marx would have said that. Hence, you know, the theory of productive forces, etc., etc. But you can't just then say, well, you know, we've got a problem with these big 10 developers. And I'm like, well, then that's a problem with the whole system itself. The system itself created the situation that we're in at the moment.
That's a good point. We will come back to that. Russell Quirk, thank you so much indeed for sharing your expertise and knowledge on that. He knows a thing or...
I mean, it's really interesting watching capitalists in real time realize that things that they believe might actually have some amount of faults with it, right? And then just going, well, I'm not a socialist. Honestly, I'm not a socialist. A real interesting moment there. A real interesting moment. But he's right. We do need to build more council houses. We do need to get out of the grip of the big 10 developers. But it's going to take state intervention, right? My big piece of disagreement there was really with his summary of state council house builders as not knowing how to develop properly, with no real evidence for this, despite, again, the vast majority, huge swathes of this country's good quality housing was built by the state in like the 60s and 70s as council housing that then got sold off by Thatcher into the hands of unscrupulous landlords. So, you know, the solution is in fact Homes England, and it is not indeed just having more competition amongst developers, which apparently seems to be his solution. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.